The next thing we're going to look at in this lecture is the genetics of blood. So if someone asks you, what is your blood type? You might say A positive, B negative. What exactly does the A and B mean, and what exactly does the positive and negative mean? That's what we're gonna look at right now. So blood type. Blood type refers to the inherited antigens that are on the surface of your red cell. So inherited means you got it from your parents. It's encoded in your genetics, which means your blood types does not change throughout your life. Although there are some cases where people receive a bone marrow transplant, say for leukemia treatment, it's possible for their blood type to change afterwards. But for the most part, people are born with the same blood type that they will have throughout life. And these inherited antigens are going to be found on the surface of your RBC. What are antigens? Antigens are basically membrane proteins, carbohydrates, as well as sugar proteins and sugar lipids. Right? That's what glycoproteins and glycolipids means. They're a combination of carbohydrates, sugar, and proteins, or lipids. So depending on what kind of membrane proteins you have, or carbohydrates, or these things, then you would have different antigens, and the presence or absence of these antigens is going to determine what your blood types are. So when you say you are A positive, for example, you are talking about the ABO blood group, and the positive is referred to something called the RH blood group. But in fact, there are more than 30 major blood groups in the human population. So let's just quickly switch to Wikipedia right here, and you can see that these are all the different types of blood groups, right? So ABO is what we are familiar with, and then RH is the positive, negative that we talk about. But when you do a blood transfusion, it's important to take into account all these different type of blood groups to make sure that you have the maximum compatibility as much as possible, because otherwise you're gonna cause problems, right? So here's another one, like the Kell group, the Lewis, the Duffy, and the list just go on, and there are more than 30 different blood groups in total. But for people of the same ethnicity, typically speaking, a lot of these other less common blood groups are going to be shared common, and so they don't really play that big of a role when it comes to transfusion. So let's go back to the PowerPoint slides. In terms of the distribution amongst Canadians, this is according to the Canadian Blood Service. A majority of the population is O positive, right, followed by A positive, and B negative and AB negative are a little bit rare in the population. Having one blood type over the other, it's not necessarily going to make you better or worse in terms of bodily functions, but in terms of receiving transfusion, some blood types are more compatible than others, and we're going to look at that in more details coming up. So let's focus on the ABO blood group first before we talk about the RH. ABO blood type is basically describing the presence or absence of two possible antigens. Okay, do you have antigen A or do you not? Do you have antigen B or do you not? Sometimes you have both, right? And that is going to create different types of blood type within the ABO system. In the human population, there are 3 alleles that are responsible for the ABO blood type system. And if you don't remember what alleles are, you learned them last semester. The alleles are basically different version of a gene. So in this case, we're talking about the gene that determines your ABO blood type. So there are 3 versions of this gene, and they're called IA, IB, and little I. Okay? So you can combine these in various combinations because we're diploid. We have 2 sets of chromosomes. Even though there are 3 alleles in a population, at most you are going to be able to have 2 different alleles in your genome. So let's discuss this in a note now. So like I said, you are going to have two alleles in your system that would determine your ABO blood type. So let's put this in a chart format, and we are going to explain what that actually means. Okay, so here we are gonna have several rows here, and I'm gonna put type A blood, type B blood, type AB, and type O blood. So what does it mean to have type A blood? What would your genetic makeup be? Right? So in order for you to have a type A blood, your genotype is going to be IA or IA small I. Okay, so what that means is the IA allele will allow you to make the protein A, the antigen A, and put it on the surface of your red cell. So if you have two copies of the IA allele, then you will be able to make the antigen A. But just one copy of it is also enough to put the antigen on the surface. It's not about having more or less. It's just about, are you able to make it or not? So in this case, if you have one copy of the allele, that's enough to make the antigen. So in terms of RBC, what would your red blood cell look like? Right then, here's your red blood cell with a little concave here, and if you have the A allele, you will be able to have antigen A on the surface. The small I allele doesn't make anything. Okay, so it's just there. Right? So in this case, the IA allele is going to be dominant over the small I. If this is a little bit confusing, think about making cookies. Okay, if I have a star-shaped cookie cutter, you can have two of the cutters. You will be making star-shaped cookie. I can give you just one single cutter. You will still be able to make the cookies, right? So having one or having two doesn't affect the ability to make it or not, right? You might be making it faster, but that's not what we're talking about here. It's just a question of can you make it or can you not make it. So if you can make the antigen A, then you are going to be type A in this case. So similarly, for someone who is type B, their genotype is going to be IB, right? And it can also be IB small I. So being IB or IB small I means you will have the ability to make the antigen B and put it on the surface of your RBC, and that will make you a type B person. Right? Next, we have AB. So the only way for you to be an AB person is if you have IAIB, right? You have one of each of the allele. So having the IA allele will allow you to make antigen A and put it on the surface, and having the IB allele will allow you to make antigen B to put it on the surface. And if you have both antigen A and B on your RBC, then your blood type will be AB. Type O, your genotype would be little I, small I, and that will means your RBC will have no antigen on the surface. And without any antigen on the surface, we call it a type O blood, type O. So type O is the absence of A and B. Now, if you can go to your workbook, there's a similar chart that you can fill it out later. But right now, I want you to go to number 5, question 5 of lecture 2 in your workbook. And there's a chart here, okay? We are going to be comparing the ABO system with the RH. But for now, let's fill in the ABO system. Okay, the number of alleles in the population, list all. So as we just discussed this, there are 3 alleles in the population that is responsible for the ABO system, and they are IA, IB, and small I. These can then combine in various combinations to create different genotypes, and because we're diploid, we will have 2 alleles at most. So by combining them, there are 6 possibilities. Right? So number of alleles in the population is going to be 3, but then the number of possible genotypes as a result of combining these alleles will be 6. So it can be IA, IA small I, IB, IB small I, IAIB, or small I, small I. So collectively, you will have 6 possible genotypes. Number of phenotypes, that's the actual blood type that you're going to get from these combinations, are going to be 4. Right? So if you IAIA or IA small I, that would give you type A blood. These 2 genotypes will give you type B blood. IAIB will give you AB blood, and little I will give you type O blood. Okay? So that's the ABO blood system. Let's do some simple genetic problems related to blood type. A man with AB blood is married to a woman with AB blood. What blood types will their children be, and in what proportion? So if I have a man with AB blood, there is only one possible genotype for him. That will be IAIB. Right? And same thing for the woman. She's type AB, so for sure her genetic makeup will be IAIB. So in meiosis, when the man produces the sperm, half of the sperm will be carrying the IA allele, the other half will be carrying the IB. Same thing for the woman. Half of her eggs will be carrying the IA allele, and the other half IB allele. So you can use the Punnett square, the same thing you learned from last semester. The Punnett square will allow you to predict the probability of having different types of blood type in their children. So for the man, I'm going to put the man here. The man, half of the sperm IA, the other half IB. For the woman, half of it will be IA, the other half will be IB. So if this sperm fertilizes this egg, then their child would be IAIA. If this sperm fertilizes that egg, then we would have IAIB. Similarly, here we would have IAIB, and here we would have IBIB. So 1 out of 4 boxes is IAIA. That means 25% chance the child will have a type A blood. 50% chance will have a AB blood. Right, because 2 out of the 4 boxes is AB, right? And finally, 25% chance of type B. So it's interesting to see here, if the man is AB blood and the woman is AB blood, then they're not going to be able to produce type O child. So here's a question for you to think about. If a person is AB blood, okay, is it possible for this person to have a type O child, right? Is there some blood type that this person can marry to and have a child with type O blood? So think about that for a second, pause the video, and think about that. And the answer is no, you cannot. Okay, because in order for you to have a type O child's genotype is going to be small I. One of the small I must come from each parent. And if you're a type AB person, you can only pass on the IA allele or the IB allele. You will not have a small I to pass on. So AB individuals cannot have a type O child. Okay, not a biological child anyways. Okay, so it doesn't matter who you marry. If you type AB blood, you're not going to have a type O child. Okay, so keeping that in mind, let's take a look at the next problem. Suppose there are 2 newborn babies that were accidentally mixed up in the hospital. Okay, can we use the blood type to figure out which baby belongs to which parents? So before we do this problem, I just want to tell you that this doesn't happen in real life. Okay, there's no one's gonna determine which is your baby based on blood type, because it doesn't work all the time. If there is a mix-up, we use DNA fingerprinting to figure out who's the father and who's the mother. But just for the purpose of exercise and practice, we are going to try to use the blood type here to figure out which baby belongs to which parents. So go ahead, give that a try before you keep watching, and pause the video, try that out first. So if you have tried it already, here we go. We have two babies. Baby 1 is type O, so that's little I, little I. Baby 2 is type A, so the baby is IA something. We don't know if it's IA or IA small I. We don't have enough information at this point to figure it out. Let's take a look at Mrs. James and Mr. James. Mrs. James is type B, so she's IB something. Mr. James is IA IB. Okay, and for the Marshalls, they are type B, so IB something. Again, we don't know if they're IB or IB small I. We got to think about it. So if you go back to the previous slide, if you have been writing stuff down, then you remember I told you AB individuals cannot have a type O child ever because they don't have the small I to pass it on. So if you look at this, I didn't even have to write down all these things. I would know right away that baby number 1, who is type O, is not going to be the baby of the James because the father, Mr. James here, has type AB blood. Right? He can never ever have a type O child. So if these are the only two available parents, then baby 1 has to be the Marshalls. Okay? But now you might wonder, right? How is it possible for two type B person to have a type O child? Remember, when I tell you that someone is type B, I'm not telling you whether they're homozygous type B, that is IBIB, or if they are heterozygous, which is IB small I. So you cannot assume one or the other. So in this case, in order for them to have a type O child, they have to be IB little I. Okay. If you do the Punnett square, go ahead and try that yourself. There is a 25% chance that they are going to be able to have a type O baby. Okay, and so is definitely possible for them to have baby 1 as their child. Okay, and so for baby number 2, who is type A, right, is going to be from the James. Okay, and in fact, based on this information, we know that the IA came from the father, right, and then the other half is going to be a small I, which came from the mother. Okay, the other half could not have been another IA because Mrs. James here does not have an IA, right? So you can see, these kind of problems are sometimes a little bit complicated. But if you think about the general statements that I've told you, right? Like AB people cannot have type O child, and in fact, the opposite of that statement is also true, right? Type O individuals cannot have AB child either. Okay, because if you're type O, you can only pass on little I, and for you to have an AB child, you must contribute either an IA or IB. Right? So AB people cannot have type O children. Type O people cannot have AB children. Right? This is regardless of who they marry. Right? So now there is a pedigree here. A pedigree, you might remember pedigree is basically like a family tree. Square means male, circle means female, horizontal line means they get married and have kids. And so this is one generation, this is another generation, and this is another generation. So here, your job is to figure out Fiona's blood type as well as everybody's genotype. Okay. So take a moment, this should take you about 2-3 minutes to do, and then resume the video to see the answer. So hopefully you have given this a try, so now let's take this up. When you see a pedigree question like this, the first thing you want to do is to write down the genotype of everyone that you are able to, and the blood types that we can write down the genotype immediately would be AB, anyone with AB blood, and O blood. Right? So the king here is type AB blood, and I know he is going to be IAIB. So that's done for the king. Fargo over here, Fargo here is type O, so we know he is little I, little I. Okay, and that's basically everyone that we can complete the genotype at this point. So what about everyone else? The queen is type A, and I know she is going to be IA something. Shrek is IB something. Not sure about Fiona at this point. Fergus is IA something, and Felicia here is IB something. Okay, so without thinking too much, that's as much as we can do. Now we're going to try to have to logic our way through to find the missing information. And typically it's good to look at someone who's type O and look at their parents or look at their kids. And so here we have Fargo. Okay, so Fargo has one little I. Okay, so we know that we inherit half the genetic material from mom and half from dad. So this little I probably came from Shrek. Okay, so that's the Shrek small I. And then the other I, the other small I, must have came from Fiona. Okay, so now we know half of Fiona's genetic makeup. So let's keep on tracking this through another generation. Fiona got half her genetic material from King and half from the Queen. And so where did this little I came from? Well, definitely not the King, because the King is type AB, so he can only pass on IA or IB, which means the small I must have came from the Queen. Okay, so the Queen mother is IA small I. Right? Let's take a look at Felicia here. Okay, or you know what? Let's take a look at Fergus here. Fergus is IA something. Right? So where did the IA come from? The IA did not came from Shrek. Okay, we know that because Shrek doesn't have an IA, which means it must have came from Fiona. Okay, so this IA is from Fiona. And where did Fiona got her IA? Well, Fiona got the small I from the Queen. That means the IA must have came from the King. Okay, so go back to Fergus here. He got the IA from Fiona. What did he get from Shrek? Well, if you are type A blood, you are either IA or IA small I. And if you look at Shrek's genotype, he can only be passing on the small I to Fergus. So there is Fergus' genotype. Okay, he couldn't have passed on the B because otherwise that would make this person like type AB instead, right? So using similar logic, you can see that Felicia here, the IB came from Shrek, and we are going to figure out the other half. The other half is either another IB because it's type B blood, right, or a small I. And if you look at Fiona, we know that it has to be a small I. Okay, so that's how you would solve this problem. There are more practice in the workbook, so go ahead and try that out on your own.